In our world today, a lot of people think that atheism and the belief that there is no God or gods is the default worldview. In other words, any rational person should just adopt the atheistic perspective and go from there. My guest today is a fellow who had adopted the atheistic perspective for some time in his life, but kind of thought his way out of it. And it was rationality that helped bring him to a life of faith. And so we want to talk more about that in just a moment. I'll be right back. My guest is John Addington. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Hey, it's good to see you again. Just give
You
us the
too.
Cliff Notes version of your story, and particularly with the accent on your life and experience in as an atheist.
Okay. Cliff Notes is I grew up in a not Christian household, but a claim to be Christian household. And then through my childhood, I started just kind of drifting away from the idea of Christianity altogether because it seemed as the rational, reasonable thing to do was to not believe in God. A lot of the smarter guys is what it felt like were not believing in God. So that was kind of the drift away. And then just kind of in that worldview, looking into the rationale behind it, looking into the thoughts of there being no God, and going farther and farther into that, God was gracious enough to open my eyes to people that were very intelligent that had faith. Because for the longest time, it was, if you have faith, it's just no intelligence there. So I'm blessed to have that.
Yeah. What do you think in your life were the main contributing factors to your atheism?
I think the main contributing factors was the problem of evil. My childhood wasn't the most splendid childhood as growing up. So my issue was, why would a good God, a loving God, allow me and anyone else? It wasn't just me. It was, look at all the evil in the world. I mean, the 20th century has been the bloodiest century in world history. Why would God allow that? So that was a lot of where my contributing factors was, why would God allow bad things?
Yeah. It wasn't, if I remember right, we visited before, and it was not just the intellectual question of the problem of evil, but kind of an emotional response to it, right? That you were raised by your grandmother, and you shared before publicly, so I'm not violating any trust here, that
No.
That you were raised by your grandmother, and your mother was an addict. Is that correct?
That's correct. So my father died at 8 years old, and my mother was a drug addict. And then I was raised by my grandparents, and then my mother came back into my life and was all of a sudden a Christian. So that led to a lot of emotional baggage that pushed me away from Christianity.
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of the background to your story. It was both the intellectual struggles with and I guess maybe it might be worthwhile to ask which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah, I would definitely say the emotional side came first. That led me to more or less prove I was right. About my emotional thought of, like, there couldn't be a good God, there can't be that. So it led into the study of there is no God, and unlike other atheists that we may get into later that would say that it's just a lack of belief, I wanted to disprove God as much as, like, I just didn't believe. I wanted to disprove it as well, because it couldn't be. So
yeah. So that's your own personal story. Now, obviously, you can't speak for everyone, But what do you think are some of the contributing factors why people in general become atheists?
I think there's obviously, for each individual is going to be probably different, but the overarching thing is that you were discussing was emotion being one, the intellectual side of it, that there's no reason behind faith is one that I see a lot of.
Mm-hmm.
Another factor is the lack of defense, where a Christian may go to an atheist because they can't answer the questions that atheists have for them.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I would see that as well.
yeah. I know. Yeah, I know that there's a whole lot, and I've heard kind of a persistent strand of thought from people who have left the faith is that they had questions that nobody could or even bothered to answer. Now, that's not to say that they weren't answers to those questions. They just didn't have any exposure to those answers along the way.
Correct. I'll probably say something that might not be so popular to say, but there are probably many atheists that are atheists because of Christians. Um, and one of it is not that we just understand that we as Christians understand that we're inherently sinful. Someone that doesn't understand that doesn't know that a person is flawed,
Yeah.
and they want to see Christians as the answer. They're supposed to be perfect. We understand that we're not,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're on that side of it as an atheist, you look at anything that a Christian does wrong and you say, well,
Yeah.
that proves right there that that's no God. So,
Yeah.
and then the other thing that you said, another issue is, that's why I believe apologetics is so important, is Christians not knowing how to answer these questions. It's not that they don't want to, it's that, like you said, they just don't know the answers, especially off cuff. I mean, there's a lot of questions that people would ask me. I don't know the answers off cuff, but I will take the time to find the answer for you and
Yeah.
pray through that. So,
Yeah. I think that most reasonable people don't expect for Christians to be perfect.
correct.
But I think that there is that most people expect for Christians to live what might be considered to be inspirational lives. And that it's hard for people when they bump up against their, and that's no excuse, by the way, because I think a lot of times Christians that they need to step up their game when it comes to walking in moral and spiritual maturity. But all that aside, is that when people look at Christians and they see that there's just a whole lot about that Christian's life that is not exemplary, then they say, well, and unfortunately, a lot of folks too have been betrayed and hurt by Christians.
True.
Yeah. So let's go into some of these arguments that we oftentimes hear atheists make, and or statements that they make. And one of them is that I will hear oftentimes atheists say, "Well, I'm not saying that God doesn't exist. I just have a lack of belief in in God or gods." And so that's how they define atheism. What do you see as a problem with that definition of atheism?
So one of the problems I kind of have with that definition is they're kind of, in my humble opinion of it, it seems like a lot of the people there are trying to slide out the back door on coming up with an answer
Yeah, yeah,
for their worldview.
yeah,
They're trying to skip out of, like, there is some burden of proof on your part and part of that worldview. And so when they do that, they're trying to put all the burden of proof on the Christian or the theist or whatever, and trying to slide out of, like, the idea that, hey, I have to say something to my
yeah,
worldview
yeah, yeah.
by saying that is not a worldview, and we know it is.
Yeah, yeah. I say, yeah, I don't have to explain anything. I just have a lack of belief, and so I agree with you. They try to wiggle out of the responsibility of defending their position. Here's one of the ways I approach that, is that when someone says that, an atheist is just someone who has a lack of belief in God or gods, then I would say, and that's what I am. I'm an atheist. I would say, well, then you really haven't told me anything very interesting about reality, because all you've told me is what's going on for you psychologically.
Yes.
That you have a lack of belief. And yeah, that describes your own psychological experience, your own quote unquote religious or life experience. But it doesn't say anything about reality, the structure of reality. Is God really real? Or is he just like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy?
Right.
And so I'm just not interested in talking with someone who lacks a belief in God, because all they've said is what they don't believe. I want to hear why they are convinced that belief, that lack of belief, is true. And there's a big difference between the two,
Yeah, the thing that you said there is the whole time I was just thinking of truth.
Mm-hmm.
What would be their definition of truth? Is they're probably standing in a place of like there is no truth, but then they're making a truth claim, and here we are. So, but I agree.
How about, what's your definition of truth?
Do you want to hear my definition of truth?
Yeah.
Okay. So my definition of truth is something that is outside of subjectivity, that is reality regardless of outside interference.
Okay.
If we're talking about worldview. So
here's how I would couch it, is that truth is that which corresponds to reality.
Yeah.
And so
right.
Some folks call that the correspondence theory of truth. And so truth is that which corresponds to reality. How about when an atheist says that you lack any evidence that God exists? How do you respond to that?
There's plenty of things I could respond with, but I think in that situation, when someone's asked that, I think it would be critical to almost Columbo tactic from, Kokel and that, and start asking some clarifying questions on what would you consider evidence? Because I could start throwing things at them, like the universe, and I could do the Kalam for them, I could give evidence, but what would be sufficient for that person? Because that, I think that's going to be the critical step in answering that question to that person.
Yeah. I think oftentimes what they want is that when it comes down to evidence, is that they have a narrow expectation of what type of evidence that will count as evidence in their mind. And so essentially it's kind of like going into a court of law, and there's a whole body of evidence out there that has been ruled into fair play by the judge,
Right.
But as the defense attorney in this particular case, he say, wait a minute, I discount that piece of evidence. It's not convincing to me. Well,
right. Right. I agree. It just in having those conversations with many atheists and being on that side of being an atheist, when I'm going, where's the evidence for God? There was only so much that I was actually going to hear anyway when you give it. You could, because I'm going to lean on evolution and the Big Bang, where everything came from nothing, and that's not. I wouldn't have heard anything else. So that's why I think, from my standpoint, just ask, well, what would be sufficient evidence for you? Would it be God coming down and sitting with you and speaking with you would be sufficient evidence, and then you can kind of go from there as far as like what to present to that person, or even is there a reason to present evidence? Because it may not be a person that wants to hear anything. So
Yeah. You know, I knew a guy who was a strident atheist. And by the way, you know, that Christians are not the only people who can be offensive with their beliefs. You know?
that's true.
You know, and you know, when I go through, you know, I follow a lot of YouTube accounts and I follow a lot of Twitter stuff and stuff, and a lot of atheists are just downright belligerent. They don't strike me as people that you'd want to just kind of sit down and chat with in the evening. You know, it seems like they have a philosophical chip on their shoulder. Now I know that not all of them do, but this guy did, and oh man, he was all over this claim about evidence, and you know I didn't know as much as I know now about some of this stuff, but I knew enough to ask him or to say that just because I cannot prove mathematically that my wife loves me doesn't discount her love for me. And so when we try to say that this is the only line of evidence that I'll accept, whether it's scientific or some other type, or this direct and immediate experience, this undeniable experience of God that just
Right.
bowls us over, that if we're saying that that's kind of the only two places that I'm going to accept evidence, well, then we rule out all types of evidence for the existence of God, and we don't even give it fair consideration. What do you think about that?
I mean, I agree with that 100%. I mean, I was one of the belligerent atheists, and it was, I would almost try to just catch them in a corner at best I could, any chance I got. So it was, if I was around a Christian, they almost didn't want to have conversations with me, to being, I don't want to talk to this guy. He's going to start asking me questions and he's going to try to pin me up in a corner. And so, but like you said, it really was like a philosophical chip on my shoulder. I think that's a perfect example, because it really was that in that worldview, because I had emotion wrapped up in it, and it wasn't just logic; it was emotion too. And I think that's a critical point. I love how, at least I heard it from Ravi Zacharias, where he said, "It's not the question; it's the questioner."
Yeah,
you know, and that was essentially where it ended up being for me, was just understanding it's not the questions, it's who's asking the questions, and why are they asking those questions.
Yeah. You know, let me just ask you a personal question. Are you a belligerent Christian apologist?
I am not a belligerent Christian apologist. When they said born again, I am a different person. I actually love to hear their side, because it really helps me understand where they're at. So I will definitely sit down and listen to what they have to say. And I've not done apologetics as long as some, but I've done it long enough now to where I'm starting to realize it really is the same questions mostly over and over again. And it's almost a different response to each person. You know, it may be the same information, but a different response.
Yeah. You know, we may have talked about this earlier, but just recap briefly for me. What was the turning point for you? What was the one thing that really kind of sealed the deal for you and said, you know, my atheism is not carrying water here, and I need to rethink that whole position?
The one that pulled my foundation right out from underneath me was the moral argument. I was holding on to the evil of the world and how I was really proving God the whole time. And that's what I realized I was doing, is I was actually arguing for God, saying, oh, look at all this evil in the world that's happened, and realizing that I am being subjective in my morals and saying that I think this is right. And what happened was, looking back on my life, I started to look back and I started seeing subjective moral values just poured into me and poured into me, and started to realize that
Mhm.
this doesn't make sense. Like,
Yeah.
I have no foundation to stand on, because
Mhm.
honestly, if I came from nothing, nothing matters.
Yeah.
Like, there's no life matters. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
if if someone wanted to go zing a bullet through someone's head, what's that matter?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
all subjective morality. If that guy felt like it was right, then he was right
Hmm.
on the atheist worldview. And so it really just destroyed me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. You know, in order for there to be objective evil, there has to be some sort of objective standard for the good. C.S.
correct.
Lewis talks about, we can't know what a crooked line is unless we have a concept of what a straight line is. And so that whole notion of where does objective moral values and duties come from is an important question for us all to entertain. Hey, John, we're almost out of time here today. What additional thoughts would you like to share with us before we wrap up?
Um, I guess the big thing for me would be, like I said before, in apologetics, just remember that they're lost.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know, and it there's plenty of evidence out there for the existence of God. We know that. But we're called to love, and that's what we're supposed to do. So when we're presenting any evidence, it should be with love.
Yeah.
And I that's where it got me. And that's where, just watching, apologists on YouTube and whatnot, trying to prove them wrong, just hearing how much kinder they were
Mm-hmm.
than the atheists that were just trying to tear everything down.
Yeah.
We should represent Christ when we're presenting these, because we're not representing ourselves, we're representing Christ. So my thought is, just like Dr. William Lane Craig does, just like Ravi Zacharias did,
Mm-hmm.
even Frank Turek is pretty good at just being kind to these people, because they have legitimate questions and they want legitimate answers. But remember, sometimes the questions they're asking isn't the question that they're really wanting to know the answer to.
Yeah. 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 Good. Good. Hey, John, thanks so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it. It's always great to talk to folks who kind of think deeply about these topics. And I hope that we'll be able to circle back around and connect again and have another conversation along these lines.
I'd love it.
It's always great to visit with folks like John, and I love what he said there. Kind of, it's trite, this little saying that I'm about to share is that people don't care about what you know until they know that you care. And I think that we certainly have to marry our whole Christian witness with genuine compassion and concern for others. And so let me encourage you to not be so concerned about winning arguments, but be more concerned about winning souls. And the way that you do that is to be a person who is thoroughly equipped, ready to share the truth of the gospel and to answer folks' questions along the way, but do that in a way that is gentle and respectful. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Bye bye for now.